As I mentioned earlier, Industry, Trade and Cooperatives Cabinet Secretary Eden Mohamed is now joining us in studio to talk about growing Kenya's manufacturing base. He's live with us here. CS, karibu sana.
Asante sana.
Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I want to begin by understanding your strategic plan, the focus of your ministry for the next 5 years, 2018 to 2022. Help us just brief. I know it might be a lengthy document if you were to produce it here, but help us just briefly understand where your focus is as a ministry.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Of course, as you rightly say, this is a big subject to discuss in such a short time. But what we've looked at is mapping out Kenya's industrialization journey so far, since independence, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what has happened in the global landscape to, interfere or support some of the programs that we've had. And one of the things that we have noted and observed is the significant amount of underinvestment that Kenya has suffered, especially in infrastructure and the necessary platforms that is to support business as well as manufacturing in particular. And so the last 4 to 5 years of this government has been focused on building some of those infrastructures that we should have done in the last 50 years. So, and that is really the foundation of what businesses, especially manufacturing, will be depending on. So the construction of the power supply, the construction of rail and road infrastructure, the significant expansion in the port facilities, these are all geared towards making sure that as a country, we can get into a position where we can compete in terms of manufacturing with the best in the world.
Okay.
That really is the context. At the same time, we've also been making sure that the business environment improves, and we have had significant amount of improvement in our business climate in the last few years. Now where we have reached is to basically get investors, both domestic as well as foreign, to take advantage of some of these platforms that have been built on which businesses can thrive on.
Okay.
So that is the background, and I would say that we are at a point where now businesses can say they are in a much better position in terms of competing with other countries in reducing the cost of production, in making sure that we can get things sorted.
Okay.
So that is the background, and that is where we've started, and
that's sort of your drive and focus as you look forward to the next.
Absolutely. Now it's really building on that to make sure we move to the next steps.
Well, Kenya has a well-diversified economy, significant potential of becoming an industrial powerhouse in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. You spent time explaining to me what has been done so far, but yet there are many who say that in terms of potential and achieving that potential, Kenya still falls short in terms of being called an industrial powerhouse. Where would you say have been the key barriers to this?
You see, manufacturing, unlike services, is something that takes a bit of time to make things happen. If you are to build a factory to produce a certain product, just to set up that factory takes, in some cases, as much as 12 months. That is also dependent on a lot of other supporting infrastructure that you require to actually make that work for you. So I agree with you, and that is why we looked back at where did we actually miss the plot and what is it that we should have done differently. And it is a significant amount of underinvestment in supporting businesses.
You feel that's the key issue? That
we have really missed the plot. And that is why you often hear, well, we've been the same as Korea, Malaysia, and others many years around independence time.
That's right.
But these countries went ahead and made significant investments in infrastructure. That is the springboard for businesses to actually thrive on. And that is why today, if a business takes time to transport cargo from Mombasa to Nairobi, both in number of days as well as the cost, it's much more expensive than actually to even get it to Mombasa from China. Your chance of competing can become extremely difficult.
Okay.
So those are some of the things that have played, but we have mapped them out.
What about politics and governance issues? Have they played any role in holding back the growth of manufacturing in Kenya? We know every election year, we have that sort of dip if you look at the graph. and then it takes time to recover again? What would you say about that?
Well, I think the business people are fairly smart to actually know that elections come and go, and you know, since independence we've had you know, every 5 years elections, and the noise levels are pretty much similar. So business people understand these cycles. Of course, they take a small pause just before the election, and they reorganize themselves and get things going. So that, I think, of course, has some short-term impact in that it delays people's investment programs and to some extent can disrupt briefly. But more than any other country on the continent of Africa, I think Kenya has proven itself to be a very strong democracy that believes in the rule of law, that business community, both here as well as internationally, can say, well, we can rely on this country, it respects the rule of law, and can actually get things going. So that, I would say, has an impact only around the time the election is happening, but in the long term, it is just like being in the storm in the air. We just get through it.
Do events like what we are seeing, and this wasn't part of my questions, but you have brought it up, like what we're seeing at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, do those worry you? Do investors call you and ask, we are seeing this on CNN, on BBC, an issue at the airport, at the largest airport in the country? Could those in any way affect the view that investors would have towards Kenya?
Well, I think investors do care a lot about observance of the rule of law and making sure that things are done properly. And my guess is the rule of law is being applied and due process have to be followed. And everybody has a view to tell from their point of view.
Perspective.
So it doesn't necessarily mean what is happening here makes one party right and the other party wrong. But in principle, I'm very proud, and investors have confirmed that we have, even on issues that are most significant in this country, Kenya has demonstrated the resilience and the ability to actually demonstrate that we obey and respect the rule of law.
Okay. I want to understand the role of your ministry in coordinating the relationship between national government and county government, and also inter-ministry coordination when it comes to growing manufacturing and industry. Let me give you an example, and this is something that was shared on a particular article by the Kenya Association of Manufacturing. They give this example. You might find that when you're moving goods from Mombasa to Kisumu, depending on the different levies meted out by the different county governments, you might find yourself paying 10 different things, or having to deal with 10 different systems within the same country. Hypothetically, this raises serious questions about the ease of doing business. Talk to us about what your ministry is doing to remove such barriers, even inter-county, before we talk about trade outside the country as well.
It is true, since the coming into place of county governments, there have been a number of teething problems for businesses to operate in some counties. And that relates to some tariffs that are passed by county governments, which I would say the law allows them to do. But it has been something that the business community has frowned upon to actually enable them to compete. We have talked to our county governments to say that Kenya is not competing amongst itself. Different counties should not be necessarily competing by charging more or less. Our competition is outside of Kenya. And so to move cargo from Kisumu to Mombasa, for example, you will move through 10 counties. And we are aware that there are charges that people do levy in each of these counties. I believe we continue to have the dialogue with county governors to make sure that, the negative impact this has on some of these businesses. It is a concern. It is something that we are working together with National Treasury as well as county governments in streamlining this, because it doesn't make sense for somebody to pay 10 levies moving across one country. But in the end, we also are trying to encourage counties to be much more business friendly. And just like we have the ease of doing business numbers for Kenya against the rest of the world, we are working with the World Bank to introduce how easy it is to do business in different counties in Kenya.
Okay.
And that is likely to play a role in shaping governors' thinking in terms of what they can charge and what they can't.
Some business owners feel that dialogue is not enough. They want you to rein in on county governments, to, in a sense, read them that bare-knuckled sort of conversation and tell them, listen, you need to align yourselves because you're affecting, national trade in terms of what you do within the counties as well. You think you're doing enough? You feel you're doing enough?
Well, you asked whether we obey laws in this country as government.
Okay, you're trying to do that.
And we do that very much. So I think the most powerful weapon on counties is businesses working with their feet. by moving from one county to the other. Of course, in some cases where they have got infrastructure, it might be difficult to do that. But in the long term, I think county governors are also reasonable, rational people to make sure that, you know, what they are looking for, which is creation of jobs, which is supporting the local communities through some CSR programs and others, are not interfered with because of some of the levies that we do. Where there are tariffs that are charged by central government and a similar tariff charged by county government on the same company, clearly that is an overlap, and we are working together with some of the counties to make sure that, you know, one of those charges is dropped, and if necessary, the remaining single charge can be shared between the national and the county government.
Okay.
So what we don't want to see is businesses suffer in between because of some legislative activities that have been put in place by two arms of government.
What about ministries operating independently of each other? Let me give you an example. Your vision, for example, is to grow manufacturing up to 15%, I believe. The Ministry of Environment, on the other hand, are working towards possibly reducing plastics that we have in the environment. They've, from time to time through NEMA, threatened to ban plastic bottles. How do you mediate such visions where, on one hand, your ministry has this particular vision which might clash with the vision of another ministry?
There is actually no clash in this. We aim to improve the contribution of manufacturing to the GDP of this country.
Okay.
But that cannot be done at any cost or at any price, for that matter. And so one of the most important aspects of any manufacturing entity today is to deal with issues of environmental nature. And to the extent that the environment has to be protected and things have to be done properly, then we are 100% in support of what the Ministry of Environment is doing. Of course, there has been issues raised about the pace at which this has been done, how quickly it has been, and the negative impact it has on some companies.
I'm trying to imagine those that relied on timber, for example.
In terms of things being shut down at short notice. But I can tell you, this conversation has been you know, going on for the last 5 to 10 years between the private sector and government. So
no one should act.
And when the decision comes, it is painful. Of course, everybody would wish this thing to be done in a much more involving way with everybody. But overall, I think the removal of plastics from our streets, from our homes, from our oceans is something that I'm sure you'd also value.
Okay, we'll leave that for now. President Uhuru Kenyatta, as part of the Big Four, is manufacturing, of course, and he seeks to have that grow. Specifically, if you take a look at a document Treasury released, support value addition, raise manufacturing sector's share to GDP to 15% by 2022. Now, ultimately, the growth in manufacturing is linked or driven by local demand, because all these products, as much as we'll export some, others will be sold within our market here. We've heard of made in China. We've heard of made in India. At some point, I did hear buy Kenya, build Kenya. But it seems in many ways that that push was largely on paper, but on the ground, we haven't heard much about it after its initial launch. Where are we in regards to this? And why do we have projects that are launched with a lot of fanfare, but then it's after a while, it's almost as if budgets end or focus shifts and that sort of thing. How will we grow manufacturing unless we get Kenyans interested in buying Kenyan shoes, Kenyan clothes, etc.?
Well, we make a lot of shoes, we make a lot of clothes here, and a lot of Kenyans do buy that. Of course, there are a lot more who also buy things that are made in China and other places. The people who buy in this country domestically are private businesses or individuals like yourself who we can't push to buy this or that.
But how do you convince me?
You would be the first one to complain that we are not being democratic. The focus of the Buy Kenya, Build Kenya is initially to work with government procurement program. The same way that the government has made it possible for youth, women, and people with disabilities to buy up to 30% of government procurement. For that group, is something that we would like to see, where government procures items that are made in Kenya as long as they meet the necessary standards and the necessary requirements. So the demand domestically, of course, is important. We want to make sure that we make it possible for people to buy Kenyan products. And how do we do that? Of course, where products are made here and can be made here, and we have capacity to do, we levy duties on competing products that are coming from outside of Kenya. And in most cases, finished goods, we put up to 25% duty.
Okay.
And that is sufficient safeguard to enable a manufacturer who is making the similar product here to actually compete with that. Now, of course, we are having to deal with issues where people don't pay that 25% for whatever reason. They bring things in through pioneer routes and having problems. And these are the loopholes that we are closing very quickly at the border points. And in some cases, we will be getting tougher on issues of counterfeits, for example, where people bring in substandard goods, where we will be taking some really, really painful measures on some of these people who are doing this kind of business. But overall, our focus of getting manufacturing to contribute more is something that we have mapped our road very clearly. Today, manufacturing contributes just over $7 billion to this economy, just about 10%. Yeah, that is a similar average that you see across the whole of Africa. The average of manufacturing to GDP is around 10%.
But should we compare ourselves to Africa?
Well, we live in
I had a guest here who said Kenyans need to stop comparing themselves to Africa. We need to compare ourselves to other economies.
Well, you know, we breathe the air that is around here, and we have similar bottlenecks, similar challenges.
But we should have different aspirations.
Indeed, and that is why we are pushing to 15%.
We have played around 15% for a long time. I think in 2010 we were back at 15% as well. Not according to the World Bank. At one point.
We have always been around 9, 10, 11%. And this, by the way, is not because the manufacturing sector is not growing. Manufacturing sector continues to grow every year. It's just that a significant part of our GDP comes from the service sector. Telecommunication, the financial services sector, transport, energy. These services sectors, tourism, are the ones that are growing at a much faster pace. And this is largely because of the amount of capital, investments and resources that are required to sink into a manufacturing entity tends to be much more, capital intensive, takes much longer time, and they are dependent on things that actually take a much longer time to fix. So to move a manufacturing heavy product from Nairobi to somewhere in the rest of the world requires some significant transport costs to be incurred. And that is why I was saying that, with the railway coming on board now, we will see transport costs for manufacturers come down significantly. Of course, it will have impact on transporters and so on and so forth.
There'll be some losses in some other sectors.
Some other sectors, but on the whole, we can't get it always. We just want to make sure that even transporters will have an opportunity, because between here and Uganda and most of the other exports markets, there's no rail. So the push to 15% is very clear. There are programs that are in place, and this is something that is done by private sector. The government doesn't build factories. We used to
an enabling environment.
Precisely. We used to do that, build factories in the 60s and the 70s. And I think the private sector is now saying, well, give us the room to do what we can do best. Okay. Ours is to create an opportunity for businesses to thrive, the enabling environment, reduce the cost of power, the cost of transport, make sure that the market that people need to sell their goods is there and is expanded and is growing every time. And those are the things that we're focusing on at the moment.
CS, are you concerned that trade or exports to the neighboring East Africa are dwindling? Let me talk to you a bit about that. Some studies show that countries in the region are individually working harder to raise their industrial standing, lower dependency on Kenya. For some reason, Kenya has been the big brother for a long time, and they feel that they'd like to be a bit more independent. In addition, in 2017, an economic update from the World Bank stated or confirmed that there's an influx of cheap goods from China into Uganda, Tanzania. Are you concerned by this, that as you seek to hit those targets, our neighbors around us are working even as hard to ensure that we lose any industry powerhouse title that we would have had in the past?
Of course, any reduction in trade with neighbors, so on and so forth, we will be concerned. But our overall trade with these countries is still in surplus in favor of Kenya. And each country, by the way, just the same way we are working hard to make sure we fix our own issues and improve our manufacturing capability, each country naturally seeks to do the same.
Ethiopia seems to be working even harder.
Well, but, you know, I don't want to comment about a specific country, but we are happy in terms of what we have achieved so far. There's a lot more that we can do. We have a program towards working that. There's no silver bullet to say, today we would like to build, you know, jet engines immediately. You know, we've got to build the capacity, the skills base that is required, the necessary infrastructure to support a lot of that. And I can say Kenya is, you know, comfortably way ahead of many countries. Of course, there are a few that are still ahead of us because of some historical, you know, reasons. But what we are doing is we don't want to depend on few markets that we have traditionally depended on. Today, EU makes about 25% of our markets. East Africa is about another 25%. And the rest is, you know, in the rest of the world. Now, if a neighboring country chooses to buy things from China, that is their call. Ours is to make sure that we are competitive in such a manner that we can make those countries buy from us as opposed to buy from China.
Okay.
And there are a lot of ways of doing that. Reduce things, cost of things here so that we can be much more competitive. The cost of logistics is much cheaper and much lower because eventually it's not the governments of those countries that buy, it's the citizens. And we have to make it possible for them to want to buy from us as opposed to some of those other countries.
In fact, there's something that you've mentioned that sparked some thought in me. I read a statistic recently that really surprised me, that a study that shows that Kenya buys 30 million pair of shoes in 1 year, yet we have the third largest cattle herd in Africa. Now, those figures may be, you know, blown a bit out of proportion, but if that is true, if that is public knowledge, why have we not been able to synergize in terms of our need and what we have in Kenya as national resources?
Don't believe everything you read.
Okay.
But I would say that directionally the point around shoes that are imported is true. And this is because for a very long time we have depended on imports and imports of cheap goods, second-hand goods, and so on and so forth. And the philosophy of dependent on second-hand goods, whether you're talking about shoes, mitumba clothes, motor vehicles, these are things that have to a large extent undermined the growth of our industries in those particular sectors. So we have worked together with stakeholders to make it possible for people to actually get brand new items here at similar costs, if not better, than some of those issues. So you would probably have heard about some big sale that we organized for the, you know, apparel textile sector, where we've enabled companies that are producing, you know, shirts, trousers, apparels for the US market to now sell that in the Kenyan market. You know, we have not been doing that for some historical reasons, but we have made it now possible. You know, we are producing for brands that are global out of our, you know, EPZ companies here in Kenya, but we haven't allowed them to actually sell into this market. We have changed that. We will be able to see a lot of that happening now, so that a pair of jeans, new, manufactured in Kenya by Kenyans, is able to retail at a much better price in some cases than the second-hand clothes that we are getting from outside. Okay. The same is true for shoes. We have focused, and that is why, as part of our Big Four agenda, the whole of the leather industry, which moves from the actual processing of the leather into finished product and making of the products like shoes, bags, other accessories, is a key priority for us, because, as you rightly said, more than 20 million pairs of shoes, whether they come in second-hand or cheap ones, or coming in without having to... They still come in. They still come in. Into our country. And we should allow them to come in initially until we get capacity to actually enable our people to produce. Will we have capacity by 2022? We will have capacity, and we will make sure that our people are able to produce those shoes. If you look at butter today, significant amount of butter shoes are actually produced by small Kenyan SME businesses. Bata outsourced the making of the shoe uppers to some of these small and medium-sized businesses around the Limuru area. It's a model that we want to replicate. And the only way to do that is a balance of making sure that as we build capacity in the country, train more people to actually make these shoes, then we can start shutting down on the second hands and the imports through tariffs or making sure that we don't allow things that should not be coming into our country.
You've actually made a very good point with your statement, but how are you going to achieve this unless Treasury gives you the money that you ask for? And you have stated that underinvestment has been the big issue, and at this moment I'm not quite sure I see an increase in investment in manufacturing unless you could...
Well, you see, the government, what a lot of people confuse about is who does manufacturing. Actually, manufacturing,
you said it's private sector,
is predominantly a private sector function. There are certain things that as government we do. One is we deal with issues policy to make sure that are the policies that we have in place conducive and the right one to spur manufacturing of those products here in Kenya. The second thing is there are certain costs that have proven to be difficult for businesses to absorb, and therefore they decide not to set up shop in this particular place. So for example, tanneries and tanning businesses is a very expensive business. Leather processing is one of the most effluent rich, so to speak, sectors that requires heavy investment in effluent treatment plants. Now, no individual company can actually invest in that, and so as government we try and help in building and dealing with some of these shared infrastructure type costs to support businesses to come in. And so, and for that reason, private sector tend to say, well, I think I need to set up in another country instead of here because it's more expensive to set up things in this country. And it brings me to the point that I made earlier on, that a key part of the challenges that we faced historically has been Kenya has been an expensive place to do business for a very long time. Whether you're talking transport, whether you're talking electricity, whether you're talking cost of labor, and many others. And the policy direction that the government has taken in the last 5 years to fix some of these things is going to bear fruit, and we need to work together till 2022 to demonstrate some of these issues. And we want to get investors, both domestic as well as foreign, to actually come and set up shop here because they can win and they can compete more effectively from Kenya.
How do you respond, CS, to those who say that Kenya missed critical opportunities to grow one of our manufacturing sectors, that is construction, by allowing the materials that would have been used to set up the first phase of the SGR to be 60 or 70% sourced from the local market, as opposed to the roughly 30% that was sourced from the local market? There are those who say we had a chance to grow the construction production of raw materials in our country if we had swayed our purchasing that way, but we instead chose to allow China to bring in 70% of construction materials and 30% came from the local market.
Well, the most significant part of the SGR cost, actually, apart from land compensation, by the way, which is nothing to do with Chinese, is the actual cost of the steel that is laid for the rail. And we don't have those products, to be fair. But it is true that we could have pushed a lot more local content here. And, cement, for example, was one of the products that started initially with imports from China, because our cement in the companies were not able to, at the beginning, produce the quality of the cement that is required for rail production.
Were they caught flat-footed, or was it beyond their capacity?
Well, I think it required additional investments for them to do that. The good thing is, when the specifications were made, investments were made, and towards the second half of the construction, our companies were producing all the cement that was required for that.
All the cement? All
the cement that was required. And by the way, that is why you see, amongst many other reasons, that some of our cement companies are saying that their profits have come down. It's because there was a significant amount of sale to SGR amongst many other people in the economy that has now stopped.
How have we phased phase 2 of the SGR, for example? Have we changed in terms of, can we say our companies now have better capacity?
We have contractually agreed with the Chinese construction company that at least 40% of the cost of construction must be Kenyan sourced.
Not 50 or 60?
Well, to be honest with you, if we can do it much cheaper, it can even be 100. But realistically speaking, a lot of those materials we actually don't have the capacity to produce. Where we have, we make sure that it's sourced out of Kenya.
Okay, but we still missed a critical opportunity. If we had the capacity to produce that here, then you and I would be having a very different conversation in studio here today.
Well, just to give you an example, to set up a steel plant will cost you about $2 to $3 billion.
Not billion Kenya shillings.
So you tell me what opportunity you have missed in making sure that you can set up, you know, how long it will take you to do that, to fund that program so that you can actually make those steel products to enable the supply of those products out of Kenya.
Are you now in sort of letting local contractors know what the government's plans are for the next 4 or 5 years so that they can, in a sense, begin to prepare that if there's a project in 2021 that, you know, local contractors can get involved in, they can begin preparing themselves right now, as opposed to reading it in the news that the government is going ahead with this project and they had no idea about it?
We have a lot of dialogue with the private sector, the manufacturers. These are people who are part and parcel of our economy, a big driver. And we dialogue on what is working and what is not working in so far as supporting manufacturers is concerned. And yes, there are a number of significant contracts that come in. Some are donor funded, some don't pay VAT, others do. And our manufacturers have raised some issues which we are working together with our colleagues in Treasury to make sure that our manufacturers are not disadvantaged. And by the way, in some sectors like pharmaceutical and others, preference is given to local manufacturers. If their price is even much higher by 15%, we still give preference to the local companies to provide some of those products. So there are a lot of ways that we have put policies in place to support local manufacturing, but we also don't want to build complacency and, you know, low productivity by subsidizing or providing significant amount of cushion, because we want to compete with the best in the world.
Okay.
We don't want to compete just within Kenya because the size of the market is very...
But the Asian tigers that we talk about did favor their home industries. They did favor their home businesses, and that's why they are where they are today. And, yet
and where we are able to produce that and have the capacity, we do the same. We do the favoring. In some cases, we actually go way beyond by totally banning imports of similar products from outside of the country, like sugar.
For local contractors, private sector, who say they want to see more, what would you tell them? Because it seems you're telling them you also need to, in a sense, improve.
Well, for each sector, we have a program of things that sector needs as a policy to support their development. And we're working with each one of them. So, for example, as I said, in the pharmaceutical sector, we want to attract significant amount of production of pharmaceutical products here in Kenya, especially the generic medicine. But there are countries like India and others that have the scale to produce this much more efficiently and at a much lower cost than us. And what has been pushing down and dragging us back as Kenya and true for a lot of other African countries is the size of our market is not attractive enough to any significant investor. And that is why the recent signing of the CFTA in Kigali is such a significant issue for us.
Okay. I want to get a last comment from you on the signing of that CFCTA. But before that, corruption. What role has it played, whether in national government, in county government, in holding back manufacturing? We have had stories, again, you could dismiss them as stories, but we've have had several reports of foreign investors who came to Kenya planning to set up, but frustrated not just by bottlenecks in terms of setting up business, but also by little hints here of corruption, that you need to do this to get that, you need to do that to get that. Has your ministry experienced such reports, such complaints? And if you look at just yesterday, EACC released a report. They say Kenya is headed in the right direction in terms of fighting corruption. But Ipsos released another report, a survey where Kenyans feel corruption is the biggest issue affecting the country when they were asked if Kenya is headed in the right direction.
Well, as I said to you, the primary drivers of what we do in manufacturing is the private sector. Our role as government has been largely to improve the business environment in dealing with some of those issues that you're talking about, licensing issues, starting businesses. And if you look at the index that we have worked with World Bank in looking at our business environment, we have been the most reformed country on the continent of Africa for 3 years in a row. And I don't think there's any country that has moved 56 places up in terms of improvement on what needs to be done.
In ease of doing business.
Now, you know, to register a business, we are beginning to take that out of people's manual intervention. People can apply to register a business from their computers, laptop, at night, anytime, 24/7, without having to deal with people. We are having to remove fees, like NEMA fees and so on and so forth, that people always use to actually delay things and drag things moving forward. And so, gradually, we are killing opportunities for rent seeking to make sure that people are not in difficulties. Look at what the Ministry of Lands is doing. The registry of Nairobi is being closed to be digitized so that land transactions will now no longer be having to go around people. These are all opportunities that I think people have traditionally used or relied on to ask for bribes or anything of that nature. So opportunities like this need to be, together with the private sector, worked on. Where is it hurting? How do we close that loophole to make sure things move? I think the biggest challenge private sector people have faced, including foreigners in this country, for example, have been issues like duplicate title deeds in places where they make their investments.
Okay.
Those are real things that have been here with us, and that is part of the digitization program that the government is working on. I wouldn't deny that people are not being given difficulties through some rent-seeking delays here, but it's a journey that we all have to work together with them. We get feedback, we'll close the loophole, another one comes up, we try and close that as well.
Transparency International, I think in their 2017 report, put us at position 143 out of 100 and something countries. Okay, we've risen by 2 or 3 slots, indicating there's been an improvement, but still, when an investor looks at that list and sees Kenya at position 143, what comes to mind? And how do you fight those perceptions? Well,
what comes to mind is this is a global problem, but doesn't mean that we have to be playing in that particular league. It means that we must continue to fight that vice together. For every person who is participating in this, there's another person who is on the other side. And it's a journey that the private sector, the public officials need to work together to improve the image of our country. There's also as much a perception as there is a reality in some of these issues. But rather than spending a lot of time on saying, is this report correct or is it not correct, we just want to make sure we do what is right. We put systems in place that are tamper-proof to enable people to get on with their business without having to be delayed or roadblocks being put for people to actually seek rent.
So those who say that corruption is a national disaster, what would you say to them?
Well, that is their view.
That is their view.
That's their view. I deal with a lot of private sector. There are many of them who are doing their business extremely well. And a lot of private sector people work amongst private sectors. So they have suppliers who are private sector, they sell to the private sector, customers, they do things the way they do. If there is corruption amongst those groups, I mean, there's very little I can do about it, or we can do about it. But the important thing is the perception around corruption, of course, is high. It exists, and exists, just for your information, everywhere in the world. It's not an excuse that one is giving by saying it should be happening here because it's happening anywhere else. But it's a global problem, and therefore it has to be dealt with, some much more sophisticated than others, and we need to make sure that it does not undermine our efforts in developing this country.
Okay. So yes, it's only fair that before I let you go, I ask you about how we are preparing ourselves to exploit the One Africa economic bloc. Everybody knows the big story. 44 countries agreed to it recently. 22 countries need to ratify it, I think, locally within the individual countries for it to then become law. How are we preparing ourselves for this? Beyond the celebration that we are now moving towards One Africa, as Kenya, how are we preparing ourselves?
Let me, first of all, try and link the growth of manufacturing to what this continental free trade area is going to do. You know, for anything that you produce, you must have a market that you need to sell to. One of the things that have dragged investments in manufacturing and on the continent of Africa has been, Africa is seen as a collection of individual countries which don't talk to each other, where borders are, closed, and you deal with 20 million people here, 40 million people here, but you never see the 1.2 billion Africans that are potential customers. What has happened in this CFTA program, the Continental Free Trade Area, is the 1.2 billion people are now in scope as potential consumers and customers of any African that is producing a commodity or good in any country on the continent of Africa. So I think what has happened is significant. Trade between African countries has been very small. It's been less than 15%. So what do people do? We trade between Kenya and Europe, Kenya and China, Kenya and US. The same is true for many other African countries. But the reason why we have not been able to trade amongst African countries, which is much closer than some of those other distant countries, is we've never had a free trade arrangement that we have. And so what happened in Kigali last week is a significant development, is the creation of the biggest free trade area since the setup of WTO. And of course, there's a lot of opportunity and optimism that has struck as a result of this thing being signed. And it means a lot for our small businesses, for our medium businesses, for our large businesses, because all of a sudden, you have a choice. You are not constrained to sell to EAC countries only. You can now sell to the 1.2 billion Africans across the continent of Africa. And so I think that is going to make Africa much more attractive for investments in manufacturing and other sectors. So the ratification, of course, as you say, 22 countries need to ratify before this comes into effect. And Cabinet approved yesterday for the process to move to ratification stage by Parliament. And this is because we have demonstrated our capability as a country to be one of the export engines of Africa. Okay. Our constraint has been the market size. We've demonstrated through exports of flowers to Europe as the leading flower exports to Europe from the world. We have demonstrated our prowess in the continent of Africa to sell to the US on textiles, but we can't sell our textiles to South Africa. We can't sell our textiles to Nigeria. All of a sudden, with this Continental Free Trade Area, I think whether you are selling commodities, macadamia nuts, textile, cotton, and leather products, the 1.2 billion becomes an opportunity for us to sell to, and that is the excitement this brings. And that's the excitement this brings. Just one last one for you. An article by The Economist, I think it was yesterday or the day before, titled Opening the Market. The author wrote that trade patterns will not change in Africa until countries start making things that their neighbors want to buy. What does South Africa need that Kenya can produce? What does Rwanda need that Kenya can produce? What does Nigeria need? Although I know Nigeria and South Africa have both not yet fully come on board. Have we done that survey so that we ensure that Kenya benefits from this agreement? Well, you see, many of the things that people require are determined by customer demands and so on and so forth. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is you can't produce things that you don't have, or you don't have the competency to produce. So the natural thing to do, just like a river flowing to the lowest point, is you tend to focus on areas where you have scale and ability to produce, to compete strongly, and so on and so forth. So Kenya, for example, is one of the best global producers of tea in the world. None of these other countries are able to do. So ours is to make sure that we scale up in that area. We look at coffee, we look at a lot of other products that other countries don't have. The rest then you let the private sector, who do their own surveys in country X, country Y, to say, well, I think I want to set up in this country because it is competitive and it's much better to be than another country. And that is why we've invested significantly as government to make Kenya as a hub in many ways, to make sure that we are a competitive country better than many other African countries, to enable any private investor, be they domestic as well as foreign, to say, well, I want to be in Kenya. And that is really the stories that we hear every day, where investors say, well, we've done surveys, we've looked at all these other countries, we like to set up our office here. And it's not by accident that today you have more than 30 to 35 multinationals that have chosen Nairobi as their Africa headquarters in order to serve the rest of the continent. And these are things we want to leverage on.
Okay.
These are things that we want to say to our small-scale traders, manufacturers, to say, well, the world is beginning to open up now for a much bigger opportunity. Let's prepare ourselves to invest, because if you used to produce 1 million pieces of a specific product, today you might need to produce 100 times that much, and you will not be able to fulfill the orders from those countries.
Okay, thank you so much, CS, for finding time to be here with us. Really appreciate having this discussion, and we look forward to seeing what sort of opportunities will come about, even as President Uhuru Kenyatta focuses on manufacturing as one of his big four in terms of his agenda for the next 5 years or so. Well,